When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, Plant Lady. User, Camille76L. Posted, October 11th, 1996.
I grew up in a neighborhood where every street looked like it had been copy-pasted from a brochure. Same beige houses, same narrow driveways, same chain-link fences, slowly rustling along the edges. The only place that didn't match was the plant lady's house. That's not what her name was, of course. She had a real one. I saw it on her mailbox once, pressed into the metal in neat black letters, but nobody used it. To us kids, she was just the plant lady. The one with the yard that had eaten her house. On our street, everybody else kept their lawns clipped short and their shrubs cut into nervous little shapes. Her place looked like it had climbed out of a storybook and taken root by accident. Ivy crawled up the front steps and over the rails. Vines climbed the siding, crossed windows like fingers, threaded through the porch lattice. The front yard was a jungle of pots and raised beds and trellises woven so thick you couldn't see the porch floor beneath the leaves. In the summer, it smelled like wet dirt and crushed basil, even when it hadn't rained in weeks. To the adults, she was eccentric, said with a tight little smile. To us, she was fucking terrifying. You couldn't really see her house unless you knew how to look. From the sidewalk, all you got were glimpses. The angled corner of a roofline, the edge of a shutter, a sliver of dark glass half hidden between a hanging fern. Everything else was green. Even the mailbox had a vine spiraling up its post, leaves curling around the numbers like they were being swallowed. We used to ride our bikes past her place faster than anywhere else. She grows poison in there, my friend Caleb said one afternoon, coasting beside me. My brother said it's illegal plants. Your brother sells weed out of his Trans Am, I told him. He's not exactly the law. Caleb grinned and popped a wheelie as if the conversation itself made him braver, but when we reached her property line, he dropped the front tire fast and pedaled harder, eyes fixed straight ahead. Everybody had a story. Somebody's cousin swore they'd seen bones in one of the raised beds. Somebody else said she buried old Mr. Kessler's dog back there after it went missing. The version that scared me most came from a 7th grader who had just discovered how much power comes from scaring younger kids. She talks to the plants, he said, lowering his voice like he was giving away state secrets. And they listen. My aunt says there were men who used to come around here and they just stopped. Everyone says they moved away, but no one actually saw them leave. The plant lady took care of them. He looked at me for reaction, and I gave him one. After that, Every time I walked home alone and past her yard, I watched the plants the way some people watched strangers in a parking lot. I swore the leaves closest to the sidewalk angled toward me just a fraction when I drew level with the gate. There was a narrow gap between two big ceramic pots where you could sometimes see into the garden. If you were really unlucky, you might catch sight of her. The first time I did, I was 9. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low enough that it turned everything the color of old photographs. I'd stayed after school for a book fair and was walking home with a plastic bag slapping against my leg. When I got to her house, I told myself I'd just walk by like always. No slowing down, no peeking. Just pavement under my sneakers and then the safety of Mrs. Johnson's manicured roses next door. I made it about halfway before curiosity yanked at me. I glanced sideways through the narrow opening between two overgrown shrubs and saw her bent over a patch of something leafy near the porch, gray hair twisted into a loose bun at the back of her head. She wore overalls and a faded t-shirt, hands sunk deep in the dirt as she worked the soil around a plant. She stopped. Without turning, she said, "You're gonna trip if you keep craning your neck like that." I froze. She straightened, wiped earth on her thighs, and turned just enough for me to see her profile under the brim of her hat. Deep lines around the mouth, eyes like sharp little rivers behind thick glasses. "You can come say hello," she added. "Or you can keep sneaking past my fence like a rabbit. Your choice." My face burned so hot, I thought I might ignite. I mumbled something that might have been no thank you and half stumbled, half ran the rest of the way home, absolutely sure that if I stopped 1 foot past her gate, the ground would open and greedy roots would pull me under. That night, I dreamed her vines came in through my bedroom window, the leaves whispering against the glass. Looking back, I don't remember her ever raising her voice. I never saw her doing anything objectively strange. No bonfires, no chanting, no mysterious visitors in the middle of the night. What I remember are fragments, glimpses, the kind of things a kid stitches into a story when adults are careless with their speculation. I remember seeing her drag a heavy black bag across her yard one evening, the plastic scraping over the brick path. It was late fall, the sky was purple and swollen, and the streetlights had just flickered on. From my vantage point at the edge of the sidewalk, it looked exactly like the body bags on TV shows, long, shapeless, sagging with weight. She halted to a corner of the garden and dropped it beside a raised bed, hands on her hips as she caught her breath. Then she knelt and opened it. I bolted before I saw what was inside. In my mind, it stayed a body. Later, when the air grew cooler and the grown-ups started talking more freely on front porches after dark, other stories joined the ones we'd made up. About men. "You hear about Trask?" my father said one night, voice carrying through the open window. "Up and gone. Donna says he took his truck and left a note, but I call that convenient. Getting tired of the cops knocking on their door." "That man was a menace," my mother replied. "Maybe the town's better off." Another night, Mrs. Johnson whispered to my mother that her cousin's ex had disappeared too. Packed a bag in the middle of the night and just left the kids, left the job, everything. She said the last time she saw him, he was shouting right in the street, and that woman from up the block was watching from her yard like she was taking notes. That woman meant the plant lady. Grown-ups had their own way of not saying her name. Soon, there was a pattern, at least in the way we told it. Man would shout, shove, drink, frighten. The plant lady would appear somewhere on the periphery, hands in the dirt, expression unreadable, and then weeks or months later, that man would be gone. Moved away, supposedly. But no one seemed to have seen any moving trucks. Kids are experts in taking disparate facts and wrapping them in the worst possible explanation. We decided she made them disappear. In middle school, when I tried walking a different route home, I found out there wasn't really another way. Our neighborhood looped around on itself like somebody had designed it after a few beers. No matter how I cut it, I ended up within sight of her overgrown front yard. Once, during a spell where nightmares came easy, I forced myself to stop by the gate and look in. The garden was a riot of greens and browns and sharp edges. Tomato cages rusted at the corners. A row of tall sunflowers stood with their heavy heads bowed like sentries asleep on their feet. Wind chimes made of old spoons clinked lazily under the eaves, and in the middle of it all stood the plant lady, sleeves rolled up, forearms flecked with dirt, holding a small shovel. Beside her, a deep hole gaped in a freshly turned bed. She looked up and caught me staring. We held each other's gaze for a beat that lasted too long. Then she said, "You grow down before you grow up. That's what nobody tells you. Roots first, then everything else." It probably should have sounded like gardening advice. At 12, with a head full of rumors about missing men, it sounded like a threat dressed as a proverb. I mumbled a greeting and I kept going, feeling her eyes on my back all the way to the corner. Well, years slipped by. More men came and went. More stories circulated. A truck driver who stopped calling. A guy who did cash work at the gas station and took off during the night. A boyfriend of my babysitter's cousin who used to lean too close when he talked and made my skin crawl, then stopped showing up entirely. Nobody filed missing persons reports that I heard about. Nobody organized searches. People shrugged and said, he wasn't much good anyway. We still blamed the plant lady because that made a better story than bad men run when the heat gets near them. It kept our world tidy. The danger was contained in one house, behind one fence. As long as you didn't go in, you were safe. Then I left for college, and the plant lady receded into the category of childhood spooks. Bloody Mary, the dark under the bed, the crack in the closet door. I thought of her sometimes when I saw an overgrown yard or smelled rich soil after rain. But she lived in the same mental file as old houses at the end of dead-end roads and the way the streetlights back home always flickered twice before they came on. I only came back for her funeral. My mother called in early October, voice low in that particular way small towns reserve for death announcements and scandal. "You remember that woman with all the plants, a couple doors down from us?" "Of course," I said. "The plant lady." "Don't call her that." My mother scolded automatically, then softened. She passed last week. No family nearby. The lawyer's asking for folks to help go through the house before the estate sale. I told him you were coming home anyway. I had been, but guilt is its own kind of gravity. 2 days later, I was back on our street, looking at the same houses with new eyes and older knees. Her yard didn't look as wild as it had when I was a kid. Without that perspective of being small and half hidden by the growth, I could see the structure beneath it all. The raised beds were laid out in a grid. The vines on the house had been trained along wires, not just allowed to wander. There were drip irrigation lines neatly pinned along each row, clay markers labeled with names in tidy handwriting: thyme, echinacea, milkweed, foxglove. The body bags I remember so vividly existed too. Rolled up against the side of the house were stacks of black plastic sacks identical to the one I'd seen her drag years before. Potting soil, mulch, fertilizer. I stood there a long time, staring at the brand name, feeling something uneasy and embarrassed uncoil inside me. Inside the house, a few neighbors moved quietly from room to room, sorting piles into boxes: donate, discard, keep for the estate. The air smelled like dust and lavender and that faint metallic tang old pipes carry. Her living room walls were lined with bookshelves, botany texts, field guides, herbal medicine manuals, not spell books, no leather tomes bound in mystery, just well-worn hardcovers with library stickers and sticky notes peeking out from the edges. A lifetime of learning how things grew. On the coffee table lay a stack of newspapers, all clipped and folded to local stories. I saw familiar names in the headlines, men, the ones who had disappeared. Charges filed, arrests in other states, protection orders. One article covered a domestic violence case where the woman and her children had been relocated. The margins held notes in that same tidy script. Saw bruises June 12th. Called the shelter on 17th. In the kitchen, a bulletin board sagged under the weight of business cards. Women's shelters, legal aid, a social worker's number pinned 3 times over. There were no photos of the men folks used to joke about. There were photos of their wives, their kids. Some of those faces I recognized. Some I didn't. In a small back room, a sunroom really, with light coming through textured glass, someone had left a cardboard box of notebooks and newspapers. I knelt to flip through them. They were journals of a sort, not diaries, logs. May 3rd, girl from 2 houses down came home alone again. No adults until after dark. July 19th, heard shouting at midnight from corner house. Called police when it didn't stop. October 2nd, boy with the red backpack has been limping. Watch more closely. A knot built itself in my throat as I read. The girl from 2 houses down, that was me. I recognized the details: the backpack, the worn shoes, the bike with the bent reflector. She'd been watching me walk past her gate all those years, not like prey, like a century. I found my name on one page, underlined once. She's frightened of me, the landlady had written. That's all right. Better that than frightened of nothing. I hope when she's older, she'll learn to be scared of the right things. Pressed beneath the pages was a dried flower, flattened but still faintly purple. The note beside it said, I gave this to her when she fell by the sidewalk and scraped her knees. She wouldn't take my hand, but she took the bloom. A memory surfaced so suddenly it made me sway. Falling on loose gravel one summer afternoon, skin on fire, hearing footsteps approach and a voice asking, "You all right, honey?" I refused to look up, too proud and too scared. A flower had appeared in my field of vision, held out by a mud-streaked hand. I'd grabbed it, stood up, and run without looking back. I'd pressed that flower in a book and forgotten where it came from. Somewhere in some box in some closet, it was probably still there. Outside, someone called my name. I wiped my eyes and stood, closing the notebook gently. The house felt different now. Not haunted, not menacing, just full of effort, of attention no one had ever bothered to thank her for. On my way out, I stepped onto the porch and paused at the top of the steps. The plants around the yard moved a little in the breeze. Nothing unusual, nothing sentient, just leaves responding to air. I thought about all the stories we'd told as kids. The way we'd crossed the street to avoid her, the way we'd whispered about bodies under the roots and men pulled down into the damp earth, the way the adults let those stories breathe because it was easier than admitting they'd all seen the bruises and heard the shouting and decided it wasn't their problem. We needed a monster, so we made one out of the woman who spent her life paying attention. She hadn't been hiding bodies, she'd been watching the people everyone else tried not to see, and for years I'd walked past the safest house on our street and never once knocked.
Subject, Motionless. User, Hope4Daisy. Posted, December 2nd, 1999.
I don't remember the exact day the depression settled over me like wet canvas, but I remember the morning I finally understood I wasn't coming back from it on my own. Sometime around March, maybe late February, the dates bled together. I'd been living in that dingy upstairs apartment and reading, the one with the rattling baseboard heater and the sag in the hallway floor. The kind of place you end up in when the rest of your life has already slid downhill and you don't have the fight left to climb back up. Every morning for months, I'd wake up and feel gravity drag my eyes open. Before my brain even got moving, the tears would start. Not sobbing, just leaking, slow and steady. My face wet before I even took a breath. It wasn't crying so much as something inside me giving up in its sleep. I couldn't haul myself out of bed unless I absolutely had to, and even then it felt like wading through cement. Most days, I didn't even bother. I'd lay there for hours with the TV on low, half asleep, half dead, staring through those mid-morning infomercials that tried selling you countertop rotisseries and miracle ab belts and cheap blenders. Sometimes the hosts' faces would get so bright and stretched looking from the camera lights that they didn't even seem human anymore. That's where this starts. Me lying there on top of the covers, sunlight poking through the bent blinds, watching some woman in a blue pantsuit brag about a juicer that changed her life when something flickered at the foot of my bed. At first, I figured it was just the TV bouncing off something shiny. A metal leg on the dresser, maybe, but then the air in the room shifted. Not the temperature, just the feel of it. Heavier, thicker. I blinked, slow and tacky, and the flicker hardened into a shape, a full grown man standing in the doorway, upright, still, quiet. I froze. Fear didn't hit me in any dramatic way. It didn't jolt me or steal my breath. It just settled in like a second weight on my chest, right beside the depression I'd been carrying for months. The figure didn't move. It didn't sway. It didn't breathe. Just stood there with his shoulders slumped forward like he'd been waiting for me to finally notice him. I thought it might have been sleep paralysis, but I could move my fingers. I wiped my face, pinched the soft part of my arm until it stung. He stayed there anyway. A shape made of thin gray haze, almost like cigarette smoke trying to pull itself together. His face, if you could call it a face, wasn't sharp, wasn't detailed, but it was there. Cheeks, brow, a hint of a jaw, and those dark hollows where eyes ought to be. I croaked out, "Hey!" My voice sounded weak, like it belonged to somebody else. He didn't answer, didn't shift, didn't tilt his head. Just stared at me with that blank, dead look. Seconds, minutes, I couldn't tell. Then, without warning, he leaned forward just a hair, barely anything, but enough to snap something loose inside me. I scrambled backward and cracked my spine on the headboard. When I blinked again, he was gone. The air lightened. The TV droned on about low monthly payments, and all at once, instead of relief, I felt this boiling anger crawl up my throat. I was mad. Mad that I couldn't even be haunted right. Mad that this thing, whatever it was, showed up and vanished before I could understand it. Mad at myself for being scared. Mad at the whole damn world for everything else. Someone had tried to talk me into seeing a shrink a few months earlier, but I didn't want to sit in some office spilling my guts to a stranger, and now, staring at the empty doorway, I couldn't help thinking maybe that person had been right. Maybe I was cracking up. Something shifted in me then. Not a big, dramatic snap, more like the first fracture line in a windshield. And for the first time in God knows how long, I got out of bed. My legs were shaky. The carpet felt strange under my feet, flattened where I'd worn the same path between bed and bathroom. I walked to the doorway where the figure had stood. Nothing, just air. But something about the hall felt watched, like the walls still remembered him. For weeks after that, I caught glimpses of him in reflections on the TV screen when it was off, in the bathroom doorway, in the corner of the living room when headlights from the street cut through the blinds. Always quiet, always still, always looking right at me. Sometimes he was closer. Once he stood so close I could have reached out and touched his chest. I didn't. Something in me, deep, old, instinctive, knew that touching him would cross a line I couldn't uncross. So I tried ignoring him, tried pretending I didn't see him, but ignoring something like that feels like ignoring a toothache. It doesn't just vanish because you're done with it. I stopped sleeping right. I stopped drifting into those infomercial trances. I stopped doing anything except watching the corners of my own damn apartment like a hunted animal. He always showed up when I went quiet inside, when I got still enough that the depression spread out and swallowed everything else. It was like he lived in that space. One morning, after days of practically no sleep, I passed out on the living room floor. Sometime near dawn, something pressed close to my face. I opened my eyes and he was crouched beside me. Not standing, crouched like an animal. His cloudy face inches from mine. I screamed. A raw, ugly sound ripped out of me, louder than I knew I could make. He didn't move, didn't blink, but he rose, more floating than standing, and drifted backward into the hallway. I didn't think, didn't consider. I just ran, bare feet pounding the wood. I dove into my bedroom, slammed the door, shoved the dresser in front of it like I was barricading myself from a break-in. I stayed that way until sunlight filled the cracks along the floor. When I finally opened the door, he was gone, completely. The apartment felt empty for the first time in months, and that emptiness rattled me worse than the haunting did, because as twisted as it sounds, it'd been the only thing I'd felt in a long time. Depression steals everything. Your sense of time, your voice, your edges. That figure was the only thing that broke through the fog, and then he vanished, like he'd done his part and was done with me. The silence that followed was unbearable. I knew I had to get out of the apartment. If I stayed in there one more day, I'd sink right back down into that madness and never get up again. So I grabbed my sneakers, didn't bother tying them, and stepped outside for the first time in what felt like years. The daylight hit me hard. I blinked against it like a mole. The air smelled cold and sharp, and I swear it felt like my lungs weren't ready for it. And that's when I felt it. Not him, not exactly. Just this heavy pressure between my shoulder blades. The same weight he carried with him when he stood in the corners, watching, waiting. I ran. Down the steps, across the gravel lot, past the dumpsters behind the building. I ran until the cold burned my chest and the world around me snapped into focus for the first time in months. Colors brighter, sounds louder, edges clearer. My heartbeat thudded like a hammer in my ears. I didn't stop until I hit the edge of the woods behind the laundromat. Bent over, hands on my knees, dragging in lungfuls of air like I hadn't breathed right since last summer, and when I finally straightened up, the world didn't look haunted. It looked alive. And for one strange, impossible moment, I did too. I don't know if that apparition meant to help me. I don't know if he was real or if my brain finally pushed back against the depression in the only way it could. Maybe he was something I built out of desperation. Maybe he was something else entirely, something that knew fear could do what hope wouldn't. All I know is this. He got me out of bed. He got me out of that apartment. He got me moving. And the tears I cried out there in the woods weren't the hopeless kind that soaked my pillow every morning. They felt like the start of clawing my way back to myself.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr. with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.